So, yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first CoRE conversation for 2024. I'm Katja Fiedler. I'm the Act on Site consultant and regional consultant for CoRE with Women's Health Grampians, and I'll be joined by my colleague Jane today.
Hi, everybody. Hi, everyone.
So the two of us will have a conversation about understanding and closing the gender pay gap. And we chose this topic because we thought it's very timely with this Friday being International Women's Day and this year's theme being Counter in, Invest in Women, Accelerate Progress. So what better time than talking about, women's economic participation, gender equality and gender pay equity as well. And we also, obviously, many of you will be aware, everyone, from the sort of media coverage last week, that the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, WGEA, have just released a new set of data for the first time ever on the gender pay gap in private companies with 100 and more employees, which we'll reference as well. So another very timely opportunity to talk about the gender pay gap. So generally our CoRE conversations are really sort of short lunchtime conversations, education, awareness building opportunities for our CoRE members that we hold every couple of months. And they are intended to be a deep dive into specific topics that we find or we deem relevant for CoRE members, or that have also been brought to us, to our attention for CoRE members to get a better understanding about. And what we will be talking about today with around understanding and closing the gender pay gap will be, firstly, what is the gender pay gap? How can we have a gender pay gap if we are legislated to have equal pay? What are the drivers of the pay gap? And what actions can employers take to address gender pay gaps? If there's time, we'll also answer questions. And please, if you have any questions throughout, put them in the chat. And our colleague Ange, who's helping in the background as well, will collate these questions while she also will be putting the resources and links to documents we're talking about and referencing in the chat. So keep an eye on the chat and make use of it. And as you would have noticed, this session will be recorded as we will put it up on our Women's Health Grampians YouTube channel for everyone to access post session. So yeah, before we get started, though, into the nitty-gritty part of what we talk about today, I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on land of various traditional owner groups. I'm up here in Horsham on the land of the Wotjobaluk, Vagaya, Japagolg, Jadwa Jali people, and Jane and others from the team, I acknowledge you meeting on the land of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nations. I would like to acknowledge that First Nations peoples in Australia have the longest living culture in this world, and for over 65,000 years, First Nations peoples have taken care of the land we're living on, recreating on and working on, and First Nations peoples have developed really strong, respectful connections to this land and looked after it, which we acknowledge is definitely something, a lot for us to learn from and to build capacity on with as well. Sovereignty's never been ceded. It always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So let's get into the deep dive. And sort of we will do it in a sort of conversation format. So asking questions and bouncing back and forth between Jane and myself. So Jane, question to you. We're here today to learn about the pay gap. So give us an example of what the gender pay gap actually is.
Right, thanks, Katja. So the gender pay gap is it's a measure. It's an internationally established measure. So it's a piece of measurable information that tracks performance. It's a metric expressed as a percentage that measures women's position in the economy in comparison to men. So it measures the difference between the average earning of women compared to the average earning of men in the workforce.
And I've seen this percentage expressed as a positive and a negative. So what does that mean? And what is a good pay gap?
So a positive percentage indicates a advantage to men, and a negative percentage indicates in favour of women. So while we should strive for a 0%, that there's no gap at all, it's sort of understood that range between -5 in favour of women and +5 in favour of men is an acceptable performance. And on this slide, we can actually see there are two figures, and those two figures are positive, so they represent a pay cap in favour of men.
Mm-hmm. So looking at one of those figures, and the Victorian sort of public sector figure of 15.6% of pay gap, what does that mean?
So if you think of the pay gap measures the difference between the average earnings of women and men in the workforce. So on this slide, we have an example in 2001, the last workforce audit undertaken by the Victorian public sector entities who were mandated underneath the Gender Equality Act to do a gender audit in their workplace. That came up as a gap overall in the public sector of 15.6% in favour of men. So that means that on average, men took home about $19,000 more than women across that financial year of 2020-2021. And in the most recent data, so this is 2024 data, WGEA have just released data for the private sector across Australia, and that's the total remuneration gender pay gap, and that was 19%, or it equates to about $18,461 that men took home in that year, more than women.
So Jane, probably a question many will sort of ask themselves, how do we get pay gaps when everyone is actually paid under agreed awards?
Yeah, so the gender pay gap's a different concept to equal pay. So being paid under awards is equal pay. So equal pay is when you have a comparable role, so it's between roles, so like roles for like work. So if I was a social worker working in one workplace and I went to another workplace, I would be paid under an award. So I'd know that I had a similar base salary no matter where I worked. And to pay people differently against comparative work is quite unlawful. Where the gender pay gap is different, it's not a comparison between like roles. So it's not comparing one social worker to another social worker. Instead, it's actually looking at a workplace as a whole or an industry as a whole and seeing, how women and men are treated in the whole workforce. And the issue is, despite that we have equal pay laws, women's economic participation reward is less than men.
Thank you, Jane. So let's look at how it's actually sort of being calculated. Can you elaborate on that, Jane?
Yeah, so it's a measure and it is expressed as a percentage. And as we said, a positive percentage is in favour of men, a negative one is in favour of women. And the formula is calculated by actually taking the average men remuneration, dividing it by taking away the average women's remuneration, dividing it by the average men remuneration, and timesing it by 100. Now, what can happen is that people in different workforces or under different sort of legislation might use a different measure for that average men remuneration. So some people might use a base salary, some people might use total remuneration, which includes all your bonuses, etc. And some workforces use a median. So the median is the middle point. If you take the highest wage and the lowest wage for men and you find the middle point, they use the median. And sometimes that's useful where you might have a workforce where there is like one person who's paid a lot more than anybody else. An example might be that in a small rural hospital, you might actually have a visiting surgeon that only comes like 2 days a week, but their salary might be a lot different to other people's in the workforce. So median is often used. And often when you do a median percentage, it comes out as a smaller percentage than the others. So for the private sector, under WGEA, companies that had over 100 staff, they were mandated under the Commonwealth law to report their gender pay gap, and that's been available since the 27th of February this year. So we're going to be looking at that a bit later on. And in Victoria, under the Victorian Gender Equality Act, those agencies defined as defined entities are mandated to submit to the Commission their pay gap every 2 years. And this is calculated at a snapshot. And the last one, when they do it at the last pay cycle before the end of that financial year. So it's just a snapshot when it's taken. And they are asked to complete that audit calculating each person's annual wage if they were working full-time. So to get that average remuneration, anybody who's working part-time, people are asked to calculate that as if it was a full-time job, and that enables us to calculate the measure. And more importantly, we can start to see where the gaps are and what we can do about it. So the challenge is that the pay gap cannot be closed simply by arguing that we do have awards or that women work part-time, because it is taken up to full-time work. So the causes of the gender pay gap are just not administrative, and we can't just say, well, you know, that's just what it is. It's entrenched in harmful gender stereotype norms, beliefs and behaviours that result in women have less access and opportunities to economic success. And this is where we can make a difference, you know, by individually and collectively challenging harmful attitudes to gender and to work.
Thanks for that explanation, Jane. Next question, or let's look as well kind of if the pay gap is something that happens over our whole work life, or sort of, yeah, what we can recognise there.
So I think this is a really challenging revelation, that through the work from WGEA, it shows that it is a factor over age. And again, I just want to say this is in the private sector, but it does show that the biggest gap occurs for women between the ages of 45 and 64. And you've really got to think about, you know, what's happening in women's lives at that time, and to think about what does that mean for women and their financial security as they plan for retirement. So, you know, there's some really big ideas to get our head around. So to summarise that, we've got this really great video from WGEA, I think, which will help us consolidate our thoughts. So would you like to show that, Katya?
Did you know that in Australia, men get paid on average 14% more than women? It's called the gender pay gap, and it's caused by many different factors.
Going up.
Expectations about traditional gender roles continue to shape career choices, with female-dominated industries and occupations offering lower pay.
Going up.
A lack of workplace flexibility to accommodate care responsibilities also affects the gender pay gap,
Level 2.
with parental leave longer for women than men.
Going up.
This results in a longer time out of the workforce for women, impacting their career progression.
Level 3. Going up.
There is also discrimination and bias in hiring, pay decisions and promotions,
Level 4.
with more men still getting promoted to senior leadership roles than women.
Level 5. Going up.
Over a lifetime of earning, the gender pay gap is even more significant. This is an economic issue. Fixing the gender pay gap will benefit us all.
Yeah, very, very powerful and insightful video that's been created by Vijaya there. So Jane, before we look into sort of the drivers of the gender pay gap though, sharing this graphic here that's sort of been released in The Guardian as of last week. Can you talk us through sort of a bit more about the data that's been released by Vijaya last week for the private sector?
Yeah, so this Australia for the first time has released data reflecting the gender pay gap at nearly 5,000 companies, and that's private companies with 100 or more employees. And this is a pay gap on the median, that is that middle point. That's what they've used to calculate this pay gap. And the teal or the greeny colours is in the negative, so that shows where there is a pay gap in favour of women, and then the tan or the brown colouring shows where the pay gap is in favour of men. And you can see over these 5,000 companies, this is a very, very strong visual graphic that shows what advantage men have in terms of their economic participation and economic success. And we had to pick, for it to work, we actually had to pick one company to show. And so we went to the one that was highest, in favour of men. And we can see that Hunter Primary Care Limited there has a pay gap of 73.1% in favour of men. And still realising they're using the median, that they're not, they're trying to find that middle point about how high that is. And there are a number of companies, a small number coloured in grey, that actually have no pay gap at all. So it does show that it is actually, it is quite possible. And again, it's showing what's happening within that organisation, in that workforce, what opportunities there are for men and women to have financial success. And we've dropped that link into the article, and people can push on any of those dots and you'll find companies that you recognise. You can think of companies that you know in your region that have 100 and more and private, and you can find them and see what their pay gap is. So, Katia, we've talked about what the issue is, what's some of the solutions. So what have you learned about the drivers for this?
Thanks, Jane. So, yeah, what you see here, the slide we're sharing is the report released by the Diversity Council of Australia and Vijaya in 2022, and that was actually their 4th report on the gender pay gap, called She's Priced Less. And one of the things that this report does is it actually looks at the drivers of the gender pay gap. And Ange would have sort of shared the link in the chat to that report as well. So, yeah, what are the drivers of the pay gap? And I think the Vijaya video has already highlighted some sort of really strong aspects and contributing factors there. So, for starters, the most significant and sort of, strongest driver is gender discrimination. We're looking at 36% make up this driver. And when we talk about gender discrimination, what does that actually mean or look like? And it can materialize in various ways, including systemic undervaluation of women's economic contributions, the allocation of less meaningful tasks to women, or for a few opportunities for professional development and promotion opportunities as well. In the workforce, gender discrimination has been linked to specific practices, for example, around workplace culture, hiring promotion practices, as well as access to training. Looking beyond gender discrimination at the aspect around care, family, and workforce participation, we can see here that years being out of the workforce are also a significant sort of contributing factor. So having taken time out of the workforce for caring responsibilities, whether it's parental leave, but also caring for other family members or other dependents, which can also then lead to fewer opportunities or depreciation of skills. Interestingly, there's a motherhood pay gap of around -5%, while fathers experience a fatherhood premium of around +7.3%. So women are much more likely to also work part-time, which impacts career progression and opportunities. And they're also much more likely to undertake more unpaid work in households, so unpaid domestic work included there. Looking at the types of jobs that impact the gender pay gap as well, it's sort of the occupational segregation as well as industrial segregation. What do we mean with these ones? So occupational segregation means the underrepresentation of women in higher paying roles within an industry. So seeing less women in senior leadership roles as chief executive officers. And there's always a sort of a figure that comes back to me that we share in other training opportunity sessions is still there's more CEOs with the name Andrew than there are female CEOs in this country. I think that's a lot of food for thought there. Although we acknowledge it's changing, but that's still a matter of fact. So yeah, seeing kind of the underrepresentation in a specific industry. And then we talk about industrial segregation as well. That means sort of industries which are typically male oriented versus or more male dominated or more female dominated industries that have an impact there as well. For example, female dominated industries, caring industries, staff earn a lot less than people would in trade companies and trade industries. And looking at occupational segregation, especially in the trade industry, is there are women in trades, but most significant majority of these women actually work in admin and clerical roles, which are generally paid a lot less than technical, engineering, and management roles. And then we also have other drivers like age, which plays a role, tenure, with the current employer, as well as more women working in government, as well as non-government organizations, so not-for-profit organizations, where we know payment salaries are a lot lower as well than in other industries.
Thanks, Katja. So how does that break down to actually, how does that impact on those drivers? How does it actually impact on your actual wage?
Yeah, good question. And here we have, I think, a very strong graphic that really sort of picks it apart to kind of see how those drivers impact what makes up the gender pay gap. So if we look at the gender pay gap as working out an average of $2.56 per hour, that women are paid less than men. And this rate comes from when the She's Priceless report was written. So this chart here shows a dollar amount per hour that each driver contributes. And we can see the gender discrimination component makes up significant amount here with 91 cents. Out of those $2.56 per hour, as well as the years not working due to interruptions, as well as the industrial segregation and all the other drivers playing into that as well. I've calculated, just looking at gender discrimination, years not working, and the sort of industrial segregation, we're already looking at $1.92 out of those $2.56. Yeah.
So that gives us a really good insight around where we can actually make a difference, because if you think about 91 cents of that 256 is around discrimination, well, that's something that workplaces can do. So what's the actions, Katja? What can we do?
Let's look at the nitty-gritty part of the action. So employers can do a lot. And we encourage, based on the Fair Work Ombudsman best practice guide as well, for companies to take actions to close the gender pay gap or work towards that. it's sort of, there's lots of benefits for companies to do so as well, whether it's beyond being mandated as well, or having less than 100 employees in private organizations. The benefits include, for example, attracting quality staff, better organizational performance, retaining staff and reducing turnover costs, meeting legal obligations and minimizing legal risks as well, accessing new markets you might not have before as a company, but also building a reputation as an employer of choice. So if we look at the different actions, or sort of overarching actions, for starters, it is about recognizing inequality. So really having a good look at your organization and what's going on, what's happening, and are there any specific drivers that sort of contribute to the gap? So are there unconscious biases in recruitment? Are there different negotiation powers? What else is going on? So really recognizing there is actually inequality happening in the workplace. Then it's important to also review pay data and practices, including if you're not mandated or if you have less than 100 employees, it's highly recommended to do that. So you can do that by creating a list of employees and their annualized full-time equivalent remuneration amounts in a spreadsheet, and then kind of also organizing these to see who sits where with their salaries and their payments, and can you recognize any sort of gendered drivers around that, or any forms of discrimination and bias that might influence this in that regard. And then we look at also considering like aspects around discretionary pays practices like bonuses or fixed market-based starting salaries. So these can lead to inequalities in pay as well. When you're sort of setting these pay amounts for bonuses and other aspects, think about whether these outcomes are for men to be better off or than women, or vice versa as well. And as I said, there might also be some unconscious bias in certain decisions that are being made. Once sort of you identified some discrepancies or some issues there, address these issues as well to promote and support work towards pay equity. So it's around correcting pay differences in a one-off adjustment, identify underlying causes of pay differences, but also addressing the underlying causes of the pay difference. So address them, not just identify, but also address them and sort of work towards overcoming these. And this might involve training, this might involve review of policies and procedures, but also introduction of position descriptions or new classifying wage levels. Another important aspect, our bread and butter is introduce initiatives to improve gender equality, as well as meeting obligations under legislation. Best practice employers introduce also initiatives that respond to specific needs within their workplace and forms of inequality, gender inequality. And these employers identify areas where equal opportunity can be improved, and policies and procedures are being implemented to achieve this improvement. And we'll look at this in more detail in a moment as well. And lastly, keep monitoring and reviewing as well. So sort of keep on track annually, sort of how sort of the balances are going. And other times to consider as well is when you hire new staff, when you allocate bonuses and pay rises, and when you do a pay review, look at gender-specific aspects of pay and different roles within your organizations to determine if you have any gaps so that you can fix them.
Katja, so on a real practical level, like what could employers do that could really, really start to have some transformational change in this space?
Yeah, important aspect to look at. So a few items here to really consider is have transparent remuneration policies and practices in place, and really communicate these to all staff as well, make them accessible to all staff, and be open for staff to sort of come back with questions as well, or provide opportunities to explain. So other than that, consider gender balances in sort of within different roles, also in leadership roles and business areas, sort of all across. Do you have a gender balance? Are you working towards a gender balance especially in your leadership team? And to sort of try to reduce job segregation within your workplace as well. Then look at recruitment and promotion practices. So really focus on considering the skills, the experiences and qualities that are most relevant to sort of jobs that are coming up or vacancies to be filled, rather than sort of going sort of with the old school ideas or traditional ideas of who's most likely suited to certain jobs, because it's always been like that. Then also look at the talent pipeline. So recognize the skills and value the skills that you already have within your business, and also look at sort of potential future leaders within your company that sort of have a potential there and that you might be able to sort of support in succession planning, acting opportunities, and sort of really supporting to grow into leadership roles. Offer flexible work arrangements to all your employees in the workforce. So we're saying it's important to introduce flexible work arrangements, but also ensure it's not only something sort of that more women are seeking, but also an opportunity for men to look into working more flexible hours, flexible days, to have a better work-life balance and take on caring responsibilities and other responsibilities outside of the workplace. Ensure that employees in flexible arrangements have access to the same benefits, same training, and same promotion opportunities as any other employees that work full-time. Support women to return to work after parental leave and really minimize any disruptions that there might be coming back into the workforce post-parental leave when it comes to career progression and promotion opportunity. And also, on the other hand, encourage more men to take up parental leave, promote the role of fathers. Conduct annual gender pay equity audits and continue to monitor and review these. And lastly, make sure you also review overtime and shift arrangements to make sure access is provided equitably to male and female and gender diverse employees. And don't assume shift arrangements are more suited to male workers than female or other workers.
So thanks, Katja. That's a lot of information, but I think to summarise, we've really got 3 takeaway points for you to try to to consolidate all this information. One is that gender pay gap is different to equal pay. It is a measure of how we value the contribution of men and women in the workforce. It's not comparing like role to like role, it's talking about what's happening in workforce. And it's driven by gender stereotypes and rigid gender roles. So we can make a difference. We can actually progress and decrease that pay gap if we really put some effort into acting on the understanding of what's causing gender inequality. So thank you so much for everybody for coming today. We've got some useful resources that we can share with everybody. We'll be sending that out in the coming days, so a bit of a summary of what's happened, and of course it's shown on the on our YouTube channel. Basically, Katja, we've got some events coming up. Would you like to share that before we finish off today?
We do indeed, because having International Women's Day coming up this Friday, kind of we're already in full swing with celebrating the day and the importance of it all week, not only on that Friday, we should all year around for starters. But we've got, two exciting opportunities coming up. The film screening, Shada, an Iranian director, female director, sort of a movie being shown at Regent Cinema, which is also a fundraiser for our event partner RISK, Family Violence Support Services. That's coming up this Wednesday evening at Regent Cinema. And there'll be some beautiful Iranian music by a local Iranian artist as well on this occasion. And then in Horsham on this Thursday, 7th of March, we have an International Women's Day panel with a number of female presenters, guest speakers. I'll be there myself talking about women in non-traditional roles and why we sort of need to change the status quo around that. And this event will be held at the Horsham Town Hall, and we're very much looking forward to that as well. So there's QR codes you can see on the screen, but we'll also put the event links in the chat as well. Exciting week, lots of opportunities to get involved with, and we hope to see you along it, some of those opportunities or all of them.
So thank you everybody for attending today. Katja and I will stay online afterwards if anybody's got some questions that we weren't able to respond to in this short presentation. But really just encourage you, if you have any questions, to reach out to your regional consultant and to seek advice around any actions that you can do to decrease the pay gap in your workplace. So thank you everybody for attending, and we look forward to catching you up with you in our next CoRE conversations. Okay, goodbye.